Caleb Vance believed in solitude the way a preacher believed in God. It was his sanctuary and his penance, the one true thing in a world that had proven itself to be a liar. The Montana mountains, sharp and unforgiving against a bruised purple sky, offered no false comfort. They promised hardship and delivered it, and for that, he respected them. He had come here after the war, trading the screams of men for the howl of the wind, and found a quiet that was not peace, but a close enough cousin. His cabin, built with his own hands from lodgepole pine, stood as a testament to his resolve, a small, defiant fist of structure against the vast, empty palm of the wilderness. He checked the line of his fences one last time before the storm hit. The air had gone still and heavy, a held breath before a scream. The clouds over the peaks were the color of lead, thick and churning. It would be a bad one, a blizzard that would bury the world in white and silence everything but the beating of a man's own heart. He finished securing the latch on the small barn that housed his single horse, a sturdy gelding named Boulder, and gave the animal a final pat. The horse shifted, snorting, its animal senses already screaming a warning. Caleb felt deep in his bones. Solitude was about to become isolation, absolute and profound. He welcomed it. It was the price of his quiet, and he had always been willing to pay. Inside the cabin, the fire was already crackling in the stone hearth, a single point of defiant warmth against the coming cold. The space was sparse but orderly. A bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs he had made himself, shelves holding tins of coffee, flour, and beans. His rifle, a Spencer carbine from the war, rested clean and oiled above the mantel. Everything had its place. Everything was under his control. This small kingdom of solitude was the only one he had ever wanted since leaving the wreckage of the East behind. He settled into a chair with a tin cup of coffee, the familiar bitterness a comfort on his tongue, and listened as the first tendrils of wind began to probe the corners of his home. The quiet was ending. The storm was beginning. Alara Finch had never known a cold so complete. It was not merely a sensation on her skin. It was a thief that stole the breath from her lungs and the strength from her bones. The fine wool coat, a testament to a life of Philadelphia comfort she had fled, was a useless vanity against the teeth of the Montana wind. She had gotten lost hours ago, her rented horse spooked by the unnatural twilight of the storm's approach, throwing her and bolting into the swirling snow. The town of Jasper Creek and the man she was supposed to meet there, a Mr. Peterson whose advertisement for a wife had been her desperate ticket out, was a lost dream now. All that remained was the snow, a blinding, endless white that devoured the world. She stumbled on, driven by a flicker of will that was more instinct than thought. Her past was a phantom at her back, the cloying scent of her late father's study, the glint in Julian Sterling's eyes as he spoke of their union not as a marriage but as the merging of assets. He had seen her as a prize, a beautiful, well-bred component of a business transaction. Her refusal had been met with a cold, smiling threat that promised to ruin her, to own her one way or another. So she had run, liquidating the last of her private assets, and answering the first plausible advertisement she could find, seeking not romance, but escape. Now it seemed she had only traded one predator for another, more elemental one. Her legs gave out. She fell into a drift, the snow a deceptively soft bed. It would be so easy to close her eyes, to let the cold take her. It felt like a deep, dreamless sleep calling her name. But a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Her mother, a woman of quiet strength, once telling her, "Dignity, Alara, is not in the circumstances we are given, but in how we rise to meet them." She could not rise, but she could crawl. With hands already numb and clumsy, she began to pull herself forward, her vision tunneling, the world dissolving into a maelstrom of white and gray. She saw a light, a faint, wavering pinprick of orange in the distance. It was likely a trick of her failing mind, a final, cruel mirage, but it was enough. She focused on it, dragging herself inch by agonizing inch toward the ghost of a hope. The sound was what pulled Caleb from his reverie. A faint, rhythmic scratching at his door, nearly lost in the rising shriek of the wind. He froze, cup halfway to his lips. It was not the sound of an animal. An animal would be seeking shelter against the leeward side of the cabin, not clawing at the door itself. He stood slowly, his hand moving with ingrained instinct toward the rifle on the mantel. No sane person would be out in this, which meant whoever was at his door was either desperate or dangerous. He peered through the small, glass-paned window beside the door, but the snow was a solid, moving wall. He drew the heavy bar from its brackets. His jaw was set. He was prepared for a half-frozen trapper, a lost prospector, even an outlaw chancing his luck. He opened the door a crack, the wind tearing it from his grip and slamming it wide against the interior wall. A blast of ice and snow flooded the room, extinguishing half the lamps. And there, collapsed on his threshold, was a woman. She was a heap of dark, snow-covered wool, her face pale as marble, her lips a shocking shade of blue. She was not moving. For a heartbeat, Caleb's first instinct, the one honed by years of isolation, screamed at him to shut the door. This was a complication of the highest order, a problem he did not want. It was a disruption to the careful order of his world. But then he saw the faint puff of her breath, a tiny cloud of vapor in the frigid air. She was alive. The part of him that was a man, the part that had once been a soldier sworn to protect, overrode the part that was a hermit. He could not leave her to die. It was a line his code of honor, rusted as it was, would not allow him to cross. With a curse that was lost in the wind's roar, he bent down, scooped her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, and carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the raging blizzard. He laid her on the bearskin rug before the fire, the sudden warmth of the room a stark contrast to the deathly chill of her body. Her clothes were soaked through and stiffening with ice. He knew he had to get them off her, and quickly. There was no room for modesty in the face of death. Working with a grim, impersonal efficiency, he unbuttoned her fine wool coat, his fingers fumbling with the small, ornate buttons. Beneath it, she wore a traveling dress of dark blue serge, equally wet. He hesitated for only a second before finding the fastenings and working them loose. He was a doctor on a battlefield, his mind detached, focused only on the task of saving a life. He stripped away the wet layers until she was only in her chemise and drawers, the fabric blessedly drier than the outer garments. Her skin was so cold it felt brittle to the touch. He wrapped her in the thickest wool blanket he owned, pulling her closer to the hearth, and began to chafe her hands and feet, trying to force circulation back into the frozen extremities. She was delicately made, her bones as fine as a bird's, but there was a stubborn set to her jaw, even in unconsciousness. She was a fighter. She had crawled to his door. Slowly, color began to seep back into her skin, from a waxy, frightening white to a blotchy pink. Her eyelids fluttered. She moaned, a soft sound of pain and confusion. He stopped rubbing her feet and moved to her hands, cradling them in his own calloused palms. They were small, with long, slender fingers, completely alien to the rough, practical world he inhabited. As he gently worked warmth back into them, her eyes opened. They were the color of a summer sky, a startling blue, and they were filled with a dazed terror. "You're safe," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The words felt strange at his mouth. "You're in my cabin. You were caught in the storm." She stared at him, then at the fire, then at the blanket wrapped around her. Her gaze flew to her own body, and a flicker of panic crossed her face. "Your clothes were frozen," he explained, his tone flat and practical. "You'd have died." She seemed to accept this, the logic of survival overriding her modesty. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness sent her slumping back down. He watched her, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. This was exactly what he had come here to avoid. The messy, unpredictable reality of other people. Her eyes focused on her hands, still held within his. He was acutely aware of the contact, of the softness of her skin against the hard ridges of his. He had not touched another person with any semblance of gentleness in years. He felt a strange jolt, an unwelcome current of feeling that he immediately tried to suppress. He started to pull his hands away, but hers, weak as they were, feebly clutched at him, as if seeking the anchor of his warmth. He stilled, looking down at their joined hands. A woman, a beautiful, half-frozen woman, had literally appeared on his doorstep in the middle of a blizzard, a creature from another world. The sheer absurdity of it, the cosmic joke of it, struck him. A dry, rasping sound escaped his throat that was almost a laugh. She looked up at him, her expression wary. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Caleb met her gaze. The earnest fear and exhaustion in her blue eyes did something to him, chipping away another piece of his carefully constructed wall. He thought of the mail-order bride advertisements he'd seen tacked up in the general store in Jasper Creek, foolish notices from lonely men seeking a cure for their solitude. He had always scoffed at them. Now, one had arrived in a blizzard, delivered to the wrong address. A wry, unexpected thought formed in his mind, and before he could stop it, he spoke it aloud, his voice low and gravelly. "Best gift I ever got," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He continued to warm her hands, the firelight casting flickering shadows on his grim face, a face that for the first time in a very long time held a trace of something other than stark loneliness. Alara stared at the man, his strange words hanging in the air between them. "Best gift I ever got." It was not said with kindness, not exactly. It was a gruff, almost bitter pronouncement, as if he were remarking on a particularly cruel irony. But it was not hostile. She saw no threat in his eyes, only a deep, weary resignation. The panic that had been a cold knot in her chest began to loosen, replaced by a profound exhaustion. She was alive. This stranger, this mountain hermit with hands like worn leather and a face carved from granite, had saved her. "Thank you," she managed to say, the words feeling inadequate. Her own hands, still cradled in his, were beginning to tingle with a painful, prickling life. She flexed her fingers, a small movement of reclamation. He released her then, and the loss of his warmth was immediate and sharp. He stood and moved to the hearth, adding another log to the fire. The flames leaped, casting his long shadow against the rough-hewn walls of the cabin. The place was small, but it was not squalid. It was meticulously clean, a space of severe and masculine order. A rifle rested above the mantelpiece, gleaming with oil. Shelves were neatly stacked with provisions. A sense of purpose radiated from every corner, the mark of a man who survived not by chance, but by discipline. It was a fortress, and she had just breached its walls. "You need to eat something," he stated, not asking. He moved to a small stove in the corner, his movements economical and sure. He spooned coffee grounds into a pot and ladled in water from a bucket near the door. The simple domestic act was so at odds with his formidable presence that Alara found herself watching him with a kind of fascination. He was a man of contradictions, a brute with a strangely gentle touch, a loner who had just saved a life. "I am Alara," she said, her voice a little stronger now. "Alara Finch." He glanced over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "Caleb Vance." He said nothing more, turning back to the stove. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the unending scream of the wind outside. The blizzard was a living entity, a beast trying to claw its way in. Yet inside this small cabin, a fragile pocket of safety had formed. Alara pushed herself into a sitting position, pulling the heavy wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her own clothes were draped over a chair near the fire, steaming faintly. "Mr. Vance," she began, feeling the need to explain, to make sense of her presence in his hermitage. "I was on my way to Jasper Creek. I had an arrangement," she faltered, the words tasting like ash. An arrangement to become the property of a man she'd never met, to escape becoming the property of a man she knew all too well. He did not turn around. Town's a 2-day ride in good weather. In this, it might as well be on the moon. He ladled something from a pot on the back of the stove into a bowl. "Storm set in. You'll be here until it breaks. Could be days. Days." The thought sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. Trapped with a complete stranger. But then she looked around the sturdy cabin, felt the heat from the fire, and weighed it against the alternative, a frozen grave under a mountain of snow. This was not a prison. It was a reprieve. He brought the bowl to her, along with a wooden spoon. It was a thick stew of venison and root vegetables, and the smell of it made her stomach clench with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt. Eat, he ordered again. He handed her the bowl, his fingers brushing hers. The brief contact was like a spark of static electricity, a sudden awareness that jolted them both. He drew his hand back as if burned and retreated to the other side of the small room, putting the table between them as he poured himself a cup of coffee. She ate, the hot stew warming her from the inside out. It was simple food, unadorned, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. With every spoonful, she felt strength returning to her limbs. She was a guest here, an intruder, but she would not be a burden. Her father, for all his faults, had prized self-sufficiency, and her mother had taught her that competence was a form of grace. When she finished, she stood, her legs still a bit shaky. She carried the empty bowl to the wash basin near the stove. "I can clean this," she said, her voice firm. Caleb watched her, a flicker of surprise in his dark eyes. He seemed to expect her to be helpless, a fragile doll from the East. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. "Water's in the bucket." As she washed the bowl, a routine began to form out of the strangeness of their situation. The storm raged, sealing them off from the world, creating an island in time. Over the next 2 days, they fell into a rhythm dictated by the simple necessities of survival. He would go out in the brief lulls to check on his horse and bring him more firewood, returning covered in snow, his face raw from the wind. She took over the cooking, stretching his meager supplies with a skill that surprised him. She mended a tear in his shirt with a neatness he had never seen. They moved around each other in the confined space with a cautious, developing grace, a silent dance of shared labor. Their conversations were sparse, limited to practicalities. "The wood is running low. I can make the coffee last another 4 days," but in the quiet moments, a different kind of communication began. She saw the way his eyes would linger on the roaring fire, a haunted look entering them, as if he saw more than just flames. He noticed the way she would sometimes pause, her hands still, her gaze distant, a shadow of fear crossing her delicate features. They were two strangers, trapped by a blizzard, but they recognized the echoes of old wounds in each other. On the third night, the storm reached its zenith. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and the cabin groaned under the weight of the snow. The fire was their only defense against the oppressive, crushing cold. They sat at the small table, the remnants of their supper cleared away, a single lantern between them casting their faces in gold and shadow. "You never said what you were running from," Caleb said. The question dropped into the quiet like a stone into a still pond. It was the first personal question he had asked. Alara looked down at her hands, clasped on the table. The truth felt heavy and dangerous, but the shared silence of the past few days had forged a strange, fragile trust. "A man," she said softly. "His name is Julian Sterling, my father's business partner. After my father passed, he considered me part of the inheritance." The words were bitter, humiliating. "He is not a man who takes no for an answer. He is powerful and cruel." Caleb's jaw tightened. A muscle worked in his cheek. He had seen men like Sterling before. Men who believed the world and everyone in it belonged to them. Men who took what they wanted. He looked at Alara, at her quiet dignity, and a cold anger settled in his gut. "So you answered an advertisement," he stated, understanding now. It wasn't a search for romance. It was a flight for survival. "It seemed the only way," she whispered, "to disappear, to put a name and a legal barrier between him and me. Any name, any barrier." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the fire. The flames danced, and in their light, he saw flashes of another time. The muzzle flash of rifles in the dim woods of the wilderness. The look on a young boy's face, a drummer from Ohio, as he lay dying. The war had taught him about men like Sterling. It had taught him that evil often wore a respectable coat. "I know about running," he said, his voice low and rough. "I came here after the war. After Cold Harbor." He did not need to say more. The name of the battle was a story in itself, a tale of slaughter and futility. "I saw things men do to each other. I figured if I was far enough away from everyone, I wouldn't have to see it anymore." He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw past the stoic mask to the deep well of pain behind his eyes. He was not just a hermit. He was a man in hiding from his own memories. In that moment, she saw a reflection of her own desperation, her own flight from a world that had become unbearable. They were not so different. The soldier fleeing the ghosts of war and the heiress fleeing the gilded cage of society. They were both survivors seeking refuge. A log in the fire collapsed, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The sound broke the spell. Caleb stood abruptly, the intimacy of the moment too much for him to bear. He moved to the window, rubbing a clear patch on the frosted pane, and stared out into the white chaos. He was a fool. He had let her in, not just into his cabin, but into the sealed-off fortress of his mind. He could feel her presence as a constant, low hum beneath his skin. He was aware of the scent of her, a faint, clean smell that cut through the cabin's familiar odors of wood smoke and coffee. He watched the subtle movements of her hands as she sewed, the way a stray strand of honey-blonde hair would fall across her cheek. These were dangerous observations. They were cracks in the dam he had so carefully built against the flood of human connection. He had come here to be alone, to cauterize the wounds of the past with the cold fire of solitude. This woman, with her sky-blue eyes and her quiet resilience, was a threat to all of it. She made him feel things he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Protectiveness, anger on her behalf, a strange and unsettling tenderness. These feelings were a vulnerability, and in his world, vulnerabilities got you killed. He had to get her to Jasper Creek as soon as the storm broke. He had to get her out of his life. He turned from the window, his face set once more into a hard, impassive mask. But as he looked at her, sitting in the warm glow of the lantern, a quiet strength radiating from her, he knew it was already too late. She was no longer just a complication. She was becoming a reason, and that terrified him more than any blizzard. The storm broke on the fifth morning. It did not end with grace, but rather collapsed from exhaustion, leaving behind a world transformed. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue, and the sun on the new snow was blinding. The silence was absolute, a pristine, unbroken blanket of white stretching as far as the eye could see. Caleb knew they had to move, and soon. The reprieve was over. He spent the morning digging out a path to the barn. The snow was chest-deep in places, a heavy, wet powder that fought him every step of the way. Alara insisted on helping, wrapping his spare coat around her and using a shovel he had fashioned from a plank of wood to clear the path to the woodpile. He watched her work, her face flushed with effort, her movements determined. She did not complain or shrink from the labor. A grudging respect, which had been growing in him for days, solidified into something more. She was not a fragile doll. She was whipcord strong, in spirit if not in body. By midday, the path was clear and Boulder was fed and watered. "We can leave tomorrow at first light," Caleb announced, his voice tight. "The drifts will be deep, but the sun should harden the top layer. It'll be slow going." Alara nodded, her expression unreadable. "To Jasper Creek." "To Jasper Creek," he confirmed. The words felt like a judgment. He was sending her away. It was what he had to do. It was what he wanted. He repeated that to himself, a litany against the growing reluctance in his chest. The rest of the day passed in a strange, tense quiet. They were no longer just survivors trapped by a storm. They were two people on the verge of a parting. The fragile domesticity they had built was dissolving. Every shared glance was freighted with unspoken words. Caleb found himself memorizing the way she looked in the firelight, the sound of her voice when she spoke his name. He was angry at himself for his weakness. He was outside, checking the makeshift leather strap he'd repaired on his saddle, when he saw it. A dark shape, moving slowly against the white expanse to the east. Then another. Riders. 3 of them. They were moving with purpose, following the low ground of the creek bed, the most likely path from the direction of the more settled territories. They were not trappers. Trappers would be hunkered down, checking their lines. These men were looking for something, or someone. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, settled in Caleb's stomach. He dropped the saddle and moved quickly, but without hurry, back toward the cabin, his eyes never leaving the approaching figures. He stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. Alara looked up from the table, where she was packing a small bundle of her few salvage belongings. "We have visitors," he said, his voice flat. Fear leaped into her eyes, stark and immediate. "Sterling, could be," he said, moving to the mantel and taking down his rifle. The weight of it in his hands was a grim comfort. "Get in the root cellar. The door's under the rug by the hearth. Don't make a sound. Don't come out until I tell you." "But now, Alara," he commanded, his voice a low growl that allowed no argument. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze locked on his. She saw the deadly seriousness there, the soldier who had taken the place of the hermit. She nodded, her face pale, and quickly moved to the hearth, pulling back the heavy bearskin rug to reveal a thick trapdoor with an iron ring. She lifted it and disappeared into the darkness below, pulling the door closed over her head. Caleb kicked the rug back into place, just as the sound of hoofbeats grew loud outside. He stood in the center of the room, the Spencer held loosely in one hand, and waited. A sharp, arrogant voice called out, "Hello, the cabin." Caleb opened the door and stepped onto the small porch, blinking against the glare of the sun on the snow. 3 men sat on horseback, their mounts steaming in the cold air. The man in the lead was dressed in a fine, city-made coat and hat, his face clean-shaven and handsome in a cruel, predatory way. His eyes were the color of slate and held an unmistakable air of entitlement. This had to be Julian Sterling. The 2 men flanking him were rougher sorts, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. "Hired muscle." "That's far enough," Caleb said, his voice calm and even. Sterling's lips curled into a disdainful smile. "Well, what have we here?" "A local savage. I'm looking for a woman. She would have passed this way. Dark coat, blonde hair. Answers to the name Alara Finch." He spoke her name as if it were a piece of property he had misplaced. "Haven't seen anyone," Caleb lied, his expression a mask of bored indifference. "Been snowed in for 5 days. No one's passed this way." Sterling's eyes narrowed, sweeping over the cabin, the freshly shoveled path, the thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney. "You're lying. We tracked her to this valley. She's a thief. Stole a significant amount of money from me. I have a warrant for her arrest." He produced a piece of paper from his coat, though he made no move to dismount or show it. "A warrant from back east holds no water here in Montana territory," Caleb said, his gaze steady. "And I told you, I haven't seen her." The rage in Sterling's face was sudden and ugly. The veneer of civilization cracked. "Listen to me, you dirt-scratching peasant. That woman is my fiancée, and more importantly, my property. I know she's in there. I will have her back. You can either give her to me now, or my associates, and I will tear this pathetic hovel apart board by board." The insult to his home was nothing. The possessive claim on Alara was everything. A cold, quiet fury, the kind Caleb hadn't felt since the war, settled over him. This was the man who had driven her into a blizzard. This was the evil she was fleeing. He had tried to remain detached, to push her away, but in this moment, standing between this predator and the woman hidden beneath his floorboards, detachment was no longer an option. He had been drawn in, and his honor, that stubborn, inconvenient code, demanded he see it through. "I think you should be on your way," Caleb said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. He shifted his stance slightly, his thumb resting near the hammer of the Spencer. It was a subtle movement, but the 2 hired guns recognized it for what it was. They tensed, their eyes flicking from Caleb to Sterling. Sterling laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think that old relic scares me? You are one man. I will be back, and when I return, I won't be so polite. Enjoy your solitude while it lasts." With a final, contemptuous glare, he He reined his horse around, and the three of them rode back the way they had come, their dark figures shrinking against the vast white landscape. Caleb watched until they were gone, his body rigid with tension. He knew this was not over. Sterling was not a man who gave up. He would be back, and likely not with a flimsy, falsified warrant, but with more guns. He had made a threat, and now Caleb and Alara were living on borrowed time. He turned and went back inside, the weight of the coming conflict settling heavily on his shoulders. He barred the door and moved to the hearth. "You can come out now," he called, his voice strained. The trapdoor opened and Alara emerged, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and defiance. She had heard everything. "He won't stop," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "He will never stop." "I know," Caleb replied, his mind racing. They couldn't outrun him. Not in the snow. Sterling had resources. He could hunt them across the territory. They couldn't stay here and fight, not against unknown numbers. He needed a defense that wasn't just a rifle. He needed a barrier Sterling's power and money couldn't easily break. He needed the law, twisted as it could be, on his side. His gaze fell on Alara. She stood before him, brave and terrified, looking to him for a solution. And in that moment, a desperate, insane plan took root in his mind. It was a drastic measure, a sacrifice of the very solitude he had guarded so jealously. But as he looked at her, he realized the solitude was already gone, replaced by something he was not yet willing to name. "He called you his fiancé," Caleb said slowly, thinking it through. "He claims you as his property." "A lie I have been running from for 1,000 miles, she answered, bitterness lacing her words. "A lie is best fought with a truth," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "He can't claim another man's wife." The words hung in the small cabin, more shocking than the blizzard's howl. Alara stared at him, her blue eyes wide with disbelief. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we ride for Jasper Creek. Not to put you on a stagecoach, but to find a preacher or a justice of the peace," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "I'm proposing a marriage, Alara. A marriage of convenience. A legal shield. It's the only way I see to protect you." Alara stood frozen, the world tilting on its axis. Marriage? To this man, this quiet, wounded stranger who had saved her life and now stood as her sole protector. It was a mad proposal, born of desperation. A practical arrangement. A shield. But as she looked at him, at the fierce determination in his eyes, at the hard line of his jaw set against the thread of Julian Sterling, she felt something other than practicality. She felt a profound and terrifying sense of rightness. She had fled one man who saw her as property, only to have another propose a union to declare her his. The irony was staggering, but the intent was world apart. Sterling wanted to own her. Caleb wanted to protect her. He was offering her his name, the one thing a man in this world truly possessed, as a bulwark against the darkness. "You would do that?" she whispered. "Give up your solitude? For me?" "Sterling left me no choice," he said gruffly, deflecting the truth of his own motivation. He was not just doing this because he had no choice. He was doing it because the thought of Sterling laying a hand on her was a fire in his gut. He was doing it because he had to. Alara took a deep breath, her mind a whirlwind. A marriage of convenience. A legal fiction to save her. It was a lifeline, but she could not, would not, enter into another arrangement based on lies and pretense. Not after everything she had been through. If she was to do this, it had to mean something more. She had to know that she was not just trading one cage for another, however well-intentioned. She met his gaze, her own clear and unwavering. "I accept your proposal, Mr. Vance," she said, her voice gaining strength and clarity with each word. "On one condition." Caleb's expression was wary. "What condition?" "If I am to be your wife," she said, her chin lifting with that quiet dignity he had come to admire so much, "then it will not be just a shield. It will be a real marriage, in name and in truth. I will not live a lie, not even to save myself. I will be a partner, not a ward. If we do this, we do it together. All of it. The challenge in her words was unmistakable. She was not asking, she was demanding. Demanding that this desperate act have meaning. She was forcing him to confront the feelings he had been so furiously suppressing. She was asking for the very thing he feared most, a true connection, a shared life. He looked at her, at the fierce honesty in her eyes, and the last of his defenses crumbled. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but beneath it, a new and powerful feeling was rising. Hope. He gave a single, slow nod. In name, and in truth, he agreed, his voice hoarse. The words were a vow, spoken not before a preacher, but in the heart of his wilderness sanctuary. A vow that changed everything. The journey to Jasper Creek was a grueling test of endurance. They left at dawn, Caleb leading the way on Boulder, with Alara riding behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist for stability. The world was a blinding expanse of white, the snowdrifts like frozen waves on a vast ocean. Caleb navigated by instinct, by the angle of the sun and the shape of the distant, snow-shrouded peaks he knew by heart. Alara held on, burying her face against the rough wool of his coat to shield it from the wind. She could feel the solid strength of his back, the tension in his muscles as he guided the horse through the treacherous terrain. With every passing mile, the reality of what they were about to do settled more deeply into her bones. She was riding to her own wedding, a stranger in a strange land, about to bind her life to a man she had known for less than a week. Yet, pressed against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart through the layers of their clothes, she felt not fear, but a quiet, resolute calm. This was right. It was a leap into the unknown, but she was not leaping alone. Caleb was acutely aware of her presence. The light weight of her arms around him was a constant, unnerving pressure. He could feel her breath on his neck, smell the faint, clean scent of her hair. He had spent years cultivating an impenetrable shell of solitude, and in a matter of days, this woman had breached it completely. He was taking her to be his wife. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. He was a man who had planned for nothing but a lonely future, and suddenly, he was hurtling toward a shared one. He told himself it was for her protection. He told himself it was a practical matter. But the lie was thin and worn, and the truth was a thrumming, powerful current beneath it. They reached Jasper Creek late in the afternoon, the town a welcome smudge of smoke and dark buildings against the snow. It was little more than a single muddy street lined with a dozen false-fronted buildings, a general store, a saloon, a livery, and a small office with a faded sign that read, Sheriff Brody. That was where Caleb headed first. He dismounted and helped Alara down, his hands lingering at her waist for a moment longer than necessary. She looked up at him, her face smudged with dirt and exhaustion, but her eyes were clear and steady. He led her into the sheriff's office. The room was warm and smelled of stale coffee and wood smoke. A large, graying man with a drooping mustache and kind, tired eyes looked up from his desk. This was Sheriff Brody. Vance, the sheriff said, his voice a low rumble. Figured that blizzard would keep you holed up for another week. What trouble brings you to town? His eyes flickered to Alara, his expression curious but not unkind. No trouble, Sheriff. At least, not yet, Caleb said. We need your help. We're looking for a justice of the peace or a preacher. Sheriff Brody raised a bushy eyebrow. He looked from Caleb's grim, determined face to Alara's quiet, resolute one. He was a man who had seen every kind of human drama play out in his small corner of the world, and his gut told him there was a deep story here. Circuit preacher won't be through for another month, the sheriff said, leaning back in his chair. But as it happens, the territorial judge granted me the authority to perform legal ceremonies. For situations just like this, he gestured vaguely, encompassing the wildness of their surroundings. You two looking to get hitched? We are, Caleb confirmed, his voice firm. He reached into his pocket and placed a small, worn leather pouch on the desk. This should cover the license and your time. The sheriff looked at the pouch, then back at them. He saw the way Caleb stood slightly in front of Alara, a protective stance that was as natural as breathing. He saw the trust in her eyes as she looked at Caleb. He had also seen 3 well-dressed men ride through town that morning, asking questions about a runaway woman. One of them, a slick city fellow, had reeked of money and trouble. Brody's instincts, honed by 30 years of keeping the peace, connected the dots. "Keep your money for now," the sheriff said, standing up. "Let's get this done. The law's the law, but some knots are best tied quickly and tightly." He pulled a ledger from a drawer. "I'll need your full names." The ceremony was short and starkly simple. It took place right there in the sheriff's office, with the setting sun casting long shadows through the dusty window. The only witness was the storekeeper, a balding man named Henderson, whom the sheriff had summoned. Alara stood beside Caleb, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. She had taken off her outer coat, and in her simple, dark dress, she looked both fragile and immensely strong. Sheriff Brody read the words from a small, worn book, his voice a steady drone. "To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for as long as you both shall live." Caleb's heart was pounding against his ribs. He was making a vow, a real one. He looked at Alara. She was his wife. The thought was a seismic shock. He felt a fierce, possessive pride that stunned him with its intensity. She belonged with him, not as property, but as a partner. His partner. "Ring?" the sheriff asked. Caleb had nothing. He had come here with nothing but his horse, his rifle, and a desperate plan. Alara, without a word, slipped a small, plain gold band from her own finger, her mother's ring, the only piece of jewelry she had kept, and pressed it into his hand. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He took her left hand, his calloused fingers trembling slightly as he slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana," Sheriff Brody declared, "I now pronounce you man and wife." He paused, a faint, wry smile touching his lips. "You may kiss the bride." The world seemed to fall silent. All Caleb could hear was the blood rushing in his ears. This was the moment of truth. He turned to Alara. Her face was tilted up to his, her blue eyes wide and searching. This was not part of a practical arrangement. This was something else entirely. He lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She did not move. He touched his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound, earth-shattering solemnity. It was chaste, brief, and yet it felt more intimate than anything he had ever known. It was the sealing of a pact, a promise of shelter, a confirmation of the vow he had made in his heart. When he drew back, he saw that her eyes were shining with unshed tears. He had meant to build a shield for her, but in that kiss he felt as though he had found a shelter for himself. They were married. The thought was no longer terrifying. It was the only thing that made sense. The ride back to the homestead was different. The sun had set, and a brilliant canopy of stars glittered in the cold, clear sky. Alara no longer rode behind Caleb. She rode beside him on a gentle mare he had purchased from the livery, along with enough supplies to last them for weeks. They were husband and wife. The words echoed in the quiet space between them. When they reached the cabin, it looked different, too. The single point of light in the vast darkness no longer seemed like a hermit's refuge, but a home waiting for their return. Inside, Caleb built up the fire while Alara began to unpack the provisions. The familiar rhythm of shared work returned, but it was underpinned by a new and potent awareness. Every glance, every accidental brush of hands, as they moved in the small space, was charged with the memory of the kiss in the sheriff's office. They were married, but they were still two near strangers, bound together by a threat and a hasty ceremony. The single bed in the corner of the cabin loomed large in the small room, an unspoken question. Caleb, his face grim, unrolled his own bedroll and placed it on the floor by the hearth. "You take the bed," he said, his voice rough. Alara looked at him, then at the bed, then at the hard floor where he intended to sleep. Her condition for this marriage echoed in her mind, in name and in truth. She had meant it. She had not agreed to a marriage where her husband slept on the floor like a sentry. but she also understood the chasm of unfamiliarity that still lay between them. They needed time. "Thank you, Caleb," she said softly, accepting his unspoken need for distance for now. That night, Ilera lay in the narrow bed, wrapped in the warmth of the blankets, but she could not sleep. She listened to the sound of Caleb's breathing, the occasional shift of his body on the floor. He was her husband. He was her protector, and he was sleeping on the floor to guard her. A wave of tenderness, so powerful it took her breath away, washed over her. She was not afraid of Julian Sterling anymore, but she was terrified of the depth of feeling this quiet, wounded man evoked in her. Caleb lay staring into the dying embers of the fire, the rifle by his side. He was on guard, listening for the sound of approaching horses, but his thoughts were not on Sterling. They were on the woman sleeping just a few feet away, his wife. He had married her to protect her, but he was beginning to realize he had done it just as much for himself. He had done it because the thought of her leaving, of returning to his empty, silent life, had become unbearable. He had fled from the world of men to escape pain, but this woman had brought a new kind of ache into his life, an ache of longing and a terrifying, unfamiliar hope. He did not know how to fight this feeling. He did not know if he wanted to. The attack came 2 days later, not in the dead of night, but in the cold, gray light of dawn. Caleb was outside, splitting firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe the only sound in the frozen morning. He had been on edge for 48 hours, his senses stretched taut, but the quiet had been unbroken. Perhaps Sterling had given up. He had allowed himself to hope. It was a foolish hope. A single rifle shot cracked through the morning stillness. The bullet splintered the log Caleb had just been about to split, showering his face with shards of wood. He dropped the axe and dove for the cover of the woodpile, his heart hammering against his ribs. He peered through a gap in the logs and saw them. 4 riders, positioned in the trees at the edge of the clearing. Sterling was not with them. These were hired guns, here to do a job. "Vance," a voice yelled. "The boss wants the woman. Send her out, and we'll let you live." Caleb didn't answer. He drew the Colt revolver from his belt, its familiar weight a grim comfort. He was outgunned and exposed. His Spencer rifle was inside the cabin. Inside with Ilera. He had to get back to the cabin. Another shot rang out, kicking up snow just inches from his head. He was pinned down. Inside the cabin, Ilera had been jolted from a light sleep by the gunshot. She threw back the blankets, her heart pounding with terror. She ran to the window and peered out, her blood running cold at the sight of the men in the trees, their rifles aimed at the woodpile where Caleb had taken cover. She saw Caleb, trapped, unable to move without exposing himself. Panic seized her for a moment, cold and paralyzing. But then the image of his face in the sheriff's office, the feel of his lips on hers, the quiet strength with which he had vowed to protect her, flooded her mind. She was his wife, a partner, not a ward. Her promise to him, to herself. She would not hide in a cellar this time. Her eyes scanned the cabin, searching for a weapon, for anything. Her gaze fell on Caleb's Spencer, resting on its pegs above the mantel. He had shown her how to load it once, during a quiet afternoon, explaining it with the same practical patience he applied to everything. "You should know how," he had said. "This land requires it." Her hands trembled as she took it down. It was heavy, alien. She fumbled with the cartridges, her fingers clumsy with fear, but his instructions came back to her, clear and precise. She loaded the weapon. Outside, Caleb was planning a desperate move. He would have to make a run for it, zigzagging toward the cabin door. His chances were slim. He took a deep breath, ready to spring. Suddenly, a window on the side of the cabin shattered. A muzzle flash lit the dim interior, and a third shot, from a direction the gunman didn't expect, echoed across the clearing. One of the riders cried out and clutched his shoulder, his rifle tumbling into the snow. The others wheeled around in confusion, startled by the shot from the cabin. That was the opening Caleb needed. He broke from cover, sprinting across the open ground, firing his revolver at the remaining men. They returned fire, bullets whining past his head, but their aim was spoiled by the unexpected attack from their flank. He reached the cabin door, threw it open, and stumbled inside, barring it behind him. He turned to see Alara standing by the broken window, the long rifle in her hands, her face pale, but her expression fierce and determined. She had saved him. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She had not been a passive victim. She had fought back. She had been his partner. "Get down," he yelled, pulling her away from the window, just as a volley of shots splintered the log wall around it. They crouched on the floor, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and shattered pine. "There are 3 left," he said, his voice tight with adrenaline. "They'll try to storm the cabin or burn us out." He crawled to the other window, peering out cautiously. "We can hold them off for a while, but not forever." Just as he said it, a new sound cut through the chaos of the gunshots. The thunder of multiple hoofbeats, approaching fast from the direction of town. Caleb and Alara exchanged a wide-eyed look. It could be Sterling with more men. But the riders were not trying to be stealthy. They were riding hard and shouting. "Drop your weapons. This is the sheriff." It was Brody's voice. Through the window, Caleb saw the sheriff and a posse of 4 other men burst from the trees, their rifles leveled. The hired guns, caught between the cabin and the posse, were completely trapped. 2 of them threw down their weapons immediately, their hands shooting into the air. The third, the one who had been shouting, hesitated for a fatal second, swinging his rifle toward the sheriff. Brody's gun bucked, and the man crumpled to the ground. Silence descended, sudden and deafening, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded man and the stamping of horses. The fight was over. Caleb slowly lowered his rifle, his body trembling with the aftermath of the fight. He looked at Alara. She was still holding the Spencer, her knuckles white. He reached out and gently took the rifle from her hands, setting it aside. Then, without a word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly he could feel the frantic beat of her heart against his own. He buried his face in her hair, the scent of her a grounding reality in the surreal aftermath. Sheriff Brody dismounted and strode toward the cabin, his face a grim mask. "Vance, you and the missus all right in there?" Caleb released Alara and opened the door. "We're all right, Sheriff. Thanks to you." "How did you know?" "That Sterling fellow set off every alarm I have," Brody said, gesturing to the captured gunman. "When he and his men rode out of town this morning, I figured they weren't heading out for a picnic. Decided to follow at a distance. Good thing I did." His eyes fell on Alara, and his expression softened with respect. "Heard a shot from the cabin. Looks like you didn't need as much help as I thought." "My wife is a good shot," Caleb said, the words filled with a pride that was deep and overwhelming. He looked at Alara, and a silent, profound understanding passed between them. The threat was gone. The battle was won, and they had won it together. In the quiet that followed, after the sheriff had taken the prisoners and the wounded man away, the adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and a stark, undeniable clarity. They stood in the damaged cabin, the morning light streaming through the broken window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The marriage of convenience had been tested by fire and had been forged into something real and unbreakable. Caleb turned to Alara, his heart in his eyes. The walls he had built around it were gone, blasted to rubble by the events of the last week, by the courage and resilience of the woman standing before him. "The marriage," he began, his voice hoarse, "the proposal wasn't just a shield, Alara. Not for me. I think I knew at the moment I saw you." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not tears of fear or sorrow. "I know," she whispered, a tremulous smile touching her lips. "My condition, it wasn't a challenge, Caleb. It was a prayer." He closed the distance between them and framed her face with his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "Alara Vance," he said, testing the name on his tongue. It sounded right. It sounded like home. "I think I love you." "I know I love you," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. He kissed her then, a kiss that was not solemn or chaste, but deep and full of promise. It was a kiss that spoke of battles won, of fears conquered, and of a future that had, against all odds, bloomed in the frozen wilderness. It was the first kiss of the rest of their lives. They stood on the porch of the house, watching the sun dip below the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose. 7 years had passed. The small, defiant cabin was gone, absorbed into a larger, rambling ranch house that had grown with their family and their fortunes. The 2 chairs Caleb had built still sat by the hearth, but now they were joined by a larger table, a child's high chair, and shelves filled not just with provisions, but with books and slate tablets. A small boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's sky-blue eyes ran laughing across the yard, chasing a stray chicken. This was Samuel, their son, a child of the mountains, wild and joyful and free. Alara, her body full with their second child, rested her head on Caleb's shoulder, her hand clasped in his. Their life was hard, but it was good. The VBRV ranch was thriving, their herd of cattle known throughout the territory for its quality. Caleb had found a peace not in solitude, but in the boisterous, loving chaos of a family. He was a respected man in the valley, a leader, a husband, a father. The ghosts of Cold Harbor still visited him on occasion, but now they were faint whispers, their power diminished by the vibrant life he had built. Alara had found her place, too. 2 days a week, the main room of their house transformed into a schoolhouse, where she taught Samuel and a handful of other children from the neighboring homesteads how to read and write. She had found a purpose that was entirely her own, yet deeply intertwined with the community they had helped to build. She had never heard from Julian Sterling again. Sheriff Brody had made sure the story of his illegal actions followed him, and he had vanished from the territory, a disgraced man. Caleb looked down at his wife, at the serene happiness on her face, and his heart swelled with a love so profound it was a physical presence in his chest. He thought back to that first night, to the half-frozen woman he had reluctantly carried into his lonely cabin. He had been a man convinced he wanted nothing, needed no one. He had been a fool. He lifted her hand, the one wearing her mother's simple gold band, and brought it to his lips. "You know," he said, his voice a low, contented rumble, "the blizzard brought me many things. Hardship, fear, a broken window." Alara smiled, leaning into him, and he met her gaze, his own eyes full of a deep, unwavering love. "And the best gift I ever got." She squeezed his hand, her heart full. The wind whispered through the pines, no longer a howl of loneliness, but a gentle song of home. Together, they watched the last sliver of sun disappear, content in the quiet, extraordinary life they had built, a life born from a blizzard and sealed with a vow, a testament to the enduring truth that the greatest strength is not found in isolation, but in the brave and tender act of letting someone in.